Okay, let's do part 2. Okay. This is episode 15 of season 2. It's called Revelations. Is there anything else I should do first of grounding or anything like that? No, I think I'm gonna keep pushing through it. At least for now. Okay. For those of you who have seen my Meet the Altars from a while ago, you will probably have some understanding at least of why some of this hits close to home for me. Like the introjective abuser type stuff, which is making me feel more masculine, like I used to be as Michael, and it is making me less comfortable wearing this. So, this is gonna hit later, I think. But it's fine. I knew what I was expecting going into this. It's nowhere near what it was like the first time when I didn't know what I was expecting. Like, I didn't know this type of thing was coming. I also, I knowingly agreed to do this. And we had a couple times where we thought about trying to do it, but we knew we weren't in a good enough place. Or I wasn't as available as I needed to be because it was gonna so specifically trigger me. So, we're doing all the things we need to do, but it doesn't make it not hard, you know? Biggest things we need to do are ground as an adult specifically, because sliding would make this type of thing worse. A lot of our protectors and or trauma holders who age slide down specifically in order to process emotions. So when we're trying to be at all emotionally detached, sliding is very counterproductive. But also, sliding makes it more easy to feel like any flashbacks or anything are currently happening and not just memories of things that happened as a kid, you know? Also, the sarcasm and the laughing and smiling and things that I keep doing are the, emotional detachment. All of us who are here do that to some extent, but primarily Snake and Alistair. And I'd probably be the next highest on that list, maybe Jade. But these things obviously aren't funny. But it's how we get through them, you know? I am also cold, so I might actually change or put something on over this. I don't know. Let's just keep going. I do want to point out a little trauma crisis related thing that they just did really well. The fact that as soon as JJ realized that it was her team who was there, she started processing out loud makes a lot of sense, because that made her feel safer. And feeling some level is safe is when you can trauma process. Otherwise, you're still in trauma response, fight or flight, crisis mode. And the response that her team had of interrupting that processing and specifically forcing her attention back on the ongoing crisis was intentionally putting her back in crisis mode long enough to get through the time sensitive issue of where Reed is. And that's an example of the type of situation of where it makes sense to do that, of you have to like remind someone, I know you feel safe right now, but it's not safe yet, and you need to still be in trauma mode, you know? Which is a horrible thing to have to do, but there are some situations and some jobs in this case that can call for that sometimes. Because that like brain function serves a purpose in actual crisis situations like this. The like mental illness component is when your brain does that outside of crisis situations. But when you have trauma responses during trauma, that is the way your brain is supposed to handle it. And your brain forces you to be capable of things you couldn't do outside of that mindset, physically and otherwise. Your like chemical composition and everything is different intentionally. It's a survival mechanism. And they did that very well, even in that short little scene. Snapping other protectors back into survival mode was also sometimes a part of my job. It sucks. But this isn't therapy for me. That's in a few days. Okay, hold on. I need a second. I need to put something else over this or change or something. Hold on. There, it's a little more comfortable. The other thing I can do if I need to is actually bring Charlie into my lap. But I think this is okay for now. The specific detail of documenting every second of your life is a common coping mechanism for DID because it helps like get around amnesia basically. So if everyone in the system or close to everyone in the system or as many people as you can get to do it and to care about it and to remember are willing to actually keep track of what they do and what they need to do and when and all of those details, then you can just look back at what happened and look forward at what you need to do. And it can help a lot to journal well and keep a really good calendar and stuff. We're not very good about those things, but we also have fewer issues with day-to-day amnesia with frequent fronters because Aura is always watching or fronting. So, and other frequent fronters have good enough communication with Aura to be able to check about those things. So it's more about dissociation generally and other forgetfulness related stuff. I'm not going to get into specifics, but the next thing I'm going to say is a little bit intense. But it's one of the other ways that people who perpetrate religious abuse, and sometimes just abuse generally, but especially I would say in religious abuse, one of the things that how do I say this? One of the things that's like self-contradicting, but that's also especially unfair to the victims is the whole thing of torturing you until you confess and then punishing you for whatever you confess to. Because the idea is supposed to be confess to stop the torture. That's generally how like torturing for information works. Tell me and then I stop hurting you. But in this case, there's no win, because you have to say, like in Reed's case right now, he has to say he's not a sinner so that there's nothing to punish him for. He can't confess to anything because then he'll be punished for it. But the response to that is that everyone's a sinner, but the perpetrator isn't punishing everyone like everyone is a sinner. So you can't find, like, it's hard to figure out the rules, basically. And a lot of times the rules in practice boil down to the abuser is right and has already decided who they feel like hurting and who they don't feel like hurting, and they are going to find a reason to defend what they do, you know? So, let's keep it all together. It's fine. I knew this was going to be hard. I did still manage to underestimate how hard this was going to be to do in this way. I'm glad this wasn't the first one that we did. It was easier to start with the psych episode. But some of these are going to be harder than we imagined. And there might at some point be some that we try to film and can't do. Especially at whatever point we start reacting to things we haven't seen before. Or at the very least, there could be large sections of the recording that we cut out if we have flashbacks or whatever. This is another really, really good example in terms of trauma stuff. And, like, the overlapping experience between flashbacks and hallucinations. Something a lot of people might not think about is flashbacks can happen in such a way where it's almost like partly a flashback and partly still processing what's actually happening around you. An example that it just showed in the episode is seeing the thing that you're having a flashback of in the room that you're actually in, even though the room that you're in isn't where that trauma happened. So the dog that she just saw, she saw it in the barn and she's not in the barn, but she just saw it again, but she wasn't seeing the barn, she was seeing the room that she was actually in, which makes it a lot harder sometimes to distinguish between flashbacks and, like, current reality when flashbacks do that. And it's also very possible to have, like, total flashbacks where every detail that you remember is the same as how it originally happened. Or to have, like, emotional flashbacks or other types of partial flashbacks where, like, little details feel like that, but it's not every component of the event. It's also a good example of JJ's trained over time go-to trauma response is fight, which is very common for the type of job that she has. It is a useful trauma response for this type of job. And it's the response that she had when the actual event took place a little bit earlier with the dogs. But especially because that was already her go-to trauma response, but even more so now because it worked in that specific scenario. Fighting, drawing her gun on them, worked. And made it stop and all of that. It was effective. So now that was her go-to response again when she had a flashback of the same thing because she knows it works. And that's also a good example of how that can happen with PTSD, of whichever trauma responses have been reinforced in that way for that context, which is one of the things that's especially common in systems, is for that to be specific to different contexts, but also specific to different alters. So different alters can have different go-to trauma responses, but also the same person or alter, in the case of systems, can have more than one go-to trauma response depending on the context. So there might be some situations where it's fight, some where it's flight, fawn, freeze, etc. Or you might have one that's your go-to, and then if it doesn't work in a certain amount of time, you have a backup one that's your next go-to. And a lot of this is not conscious choice. A lot of trauma mechanisms in the brain are supposed to happen faster than conscious decisions can be made. It's like on the instinct level of processing. Because it's a survival mechanism, it's supposed to be as fast as possible, and you're not supposed to think about it. You're supposed to be already running before you know what's happening, or already fighting, or whatever it is. So these things are deeply ingrained and very instinctual, and it can be really hard to like unlearn them, or to convince yourself you don't need to use them in a specific situation, or to learn a different one if you're in a new type of situation that needs a different one, but you're used to using an old one. All those things can be really hard. But that's an example of where the subjective experience of that flashback mimics a visual hallucination and an audible, all-around hallucination in a lot of ways. But the cause, the mechanism in the brain is different, fundamentally different, and it's important to know that for treatment purposes and for just generally understanding what's going on. The drug component of this is an example of a fairly extreme coping mechanism on the one hand, but it's also trying to figure out how I want to structure this. It's an example of another type of persecutor behavior that's not rooted in anger or mimicking the abuser or anything like that, but it's actually rooted in the belief that they're helping, that they're very directly helping in some way. And in this case, Tobias is trying to share a coping mechanism that he genuinely believes helped him, and probably did help him in some ways. But he's doing it without consent, and in fact with a very explicit no. And he thinks he's helping. He thinks he's making it hurt less, which I'm sure he is actually in effect doing. And he is interpreting the situation currently as being the same type of situation he was in growing up, that he could not get out of. And the reason that Spencer, one of the reasons at least, that Spencer doesn't want this coping mechanism is because this feels much more finite to him. He expects to either die or be rescued, basically. He's not going to spend years of his life in this environment. And if he were expecting to spend years of his life in his environment, it's very possible he would at least eventually make a different call. But that difference in perspective can be the type of thing that makes that type of persecutor of, I will make decisions that you would never make because I see the situation as more hopeless than you do, or as more desperate than you do, or whatever. Maybe because I have more information about it than you do. Maybe because it just feels more like that to me for whatever reason. And I will take extreme measures that I think are justified, even if the situation doesn't call for it anymore, or maybe never called for it. But in a lot of cases, it's something that did work at some point, but the situation doesn't call for it anymore. And that can be really hard to get through to that type of persecutor, because it can be really, really hard to convince people that the situation is safer than it used to be. I did some of that with the level of masking that I wanted us to be doing all the time. It wasn't necessary anymore. At least it very likely wasn't. I still can't totally believe that. I still on some level think the other shoe's gonna drop any day, but also that we might have just lucked out. Maybe the timing that we stopped masking so much was the first point in our life that it would have been okay to stop masking so much, that exact instant in time, you know? And we just got really lucky for once in our life. But actually believing that things are safer now, to the extent that you can stop using your coping mechanisms that have worked for you, is a really, really big ask sometimes. And I think that's important to keep in mind with, like, that subcategory, I guess, of persecutor. It's also very possible for persecutors to fall into, like, multiple of those categories. I did. I had that type of category I was just describing, but I was also, at least for a while, an introjective abuser. And I believed a lot of the things they said because of that. So yeah, these things can be complicated. But there can also be things that look very similar on the surface, but are pretty different underneath. A lot of same or very similar behaviors can be rooted in very different causes. And the way to handle them can be pretty different because of it. The other reason I expect that Spencer didn't want to use that specific coping mechanism in this situation is because he needs his wits about him, basically. He needs his intellect and focus and everything intact to have his best shot at surviving this. And he doesn't have the instincts that Tobias would, already deeply ingrained for specifically dealing with Tobias's dad. So he needs to be analyzing everything in the moment, instantly, rapidly, and looking lucid and in control of himself and everything like that. And certainly not doing anything behind the back of Tobias's dad that he could get caught doing and then get punished for. Yeah. I think it's about to call it something other than DID on top of this. But they're also arguing that there was, like, the original split that turned Tobias into a system in the first place. I have a couple issues with, because they're describing it happening in Tobias's adulthood, which is one thing. Current understanding of how DID forms is it happens in childhood, unless possibly if there are other factors affecting, like, normal development and, like, delaying that enough for it to happen later in life. potentially. On top of that, it sounds like they use the word split, but then it's splitting his dad and still having himself, which I guess could just be like a system split and not an alter split, which I don't understand as much because we seem to, for the most part, just have alter splits and not like the system splitting a new alter, but not from an existing alter, if that makes sense. But also the understanding of how systems form isn't starting from one and splitting into many, it's starting from many, never fusing into one to begin with, and then potentially splitting into more over time. But at the same time, they also talked about it being over like a moral contradiction instead of trauma related. Even though they're dealing with a case of child abuse, which would be the like classic cause of DID. Like probably the most well documented specific type of cause of DID is child abuse. Especially like extensive long-term child abuse in this case, and starting very young. And despite that, they're saying that the moral issue of is it or is it not okay to kill my dad when he asked me to is the thing that split, which that could be a thing that splits someone who is already a system. I feel like it doesn't really add up though for why the system would be there to begin with. I would argue it would be extremely likely that in this type of a situation in particular, this system has existed since childhood and has developed over time and probably split one of either the dad or Raphael alters when the dad died. Like, if I had this same list of evidence and what I know about DID, that's what I would be arguing in this case was likely to happen. But it would also be possible that those alters already existed and this event just pushed them to start doing these things like it would any singlet who started doing this type of thing. That it was just a stressor for that alter that pushed them to do these things. Carrying out their father's legacy or whatever. I don't know. Rubs me the wrong way. They just called it a psychotic fracture, which is not a description used for DID or related, which is kind of frustrating because the portrayal of DID itself is actually done pretty well in this. The portrayal of switching, the types of things that would motivate different alters, the types of things that would motivate persecutors, how different alters can be and sound and think and act and all of that stuff. The like trauma component, like they do all those things really well, and then they call it psychosis and talk about it developing in adulthood, and so it's easiest for me to look at it like they're trying to intentionally show the team misdiagnosing the criminal, but misdiagnosing him with something that, as far as I know, isn't even a diagnosis or a clinical term. Like, I've never heard of that before. And like, I went through an abnormal psychology class and a bunch of other psychology classes, and I've looked into this type of thing a lot. And if there were that comparable of an experience that would mimic DID symptoms that closely, that was called something related to psychosis, I feel like I would have heard about it by now. But I haven't specifically researched the term. Maybe it's an outdated term or something like that. I'm not sure. And I could be wrong about some of these things. I'm not a fountain of knowledge by any means, but I still have looked into this a decent amount. There also are components that I like to keep in mind at any given point where this is going to be less of an issue that I want to think about when I'm reacting to media, but more so in the context of like other people in real life talking about their experiences, is that the clinical understanding of diagnoses generally, mental illnesses, but also symptoms within those mental illnesses can be flawed. So like, and there are a lot of different ways, like there can be things about it that are outright wrong, but things could also be oversimplified, or there could be other ways that things happen. And DID is not as well researched as it should be for having been like a known disorder for so long and things like that. But like, not to say that it's possible that the disorder doesn't exist or anything like that, but almost the opposite, to say that it's possible that things that we don't yet have a clinical explanation for also exist. So I'm not going to say like definitively that it's definitely totally impossible for someone to develop a system as an adult or anything like that, because absolutes outside of the actual definition of something don't tend to be true 100% of the time anyway. But also because there just might not be research done on it yet, and we might find out in 10, 20 years that there's a whole category of types of systems that form in adulthood, for all I know. So like, I'm not gonna say that that's impossible. I'm gonna say it doesn't line up with what I know about the research of DID that already exists, which could be flawed in some of these ways, or at least is pretty likely to be incomplete. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind whenever you're trying to make confident, absolute statements about things like this. And also, especially about specific symptoms, because any given symptom tends to have more than one possible cause. And there are some symptoms that have fewer possible causes than others. Really easy example is like headaches and fatigue and stuff like that are symptoms of basically anything that can go wrong with the body. But like, there are other things that have fewer possible causes, like if you have pain in really specific places and stuff like that. But there's still often more than one different thing that can cause the same symptom, which is why diagnoses are a collection of symptoms. And we call that collection of symptoms a specific name because we decided to. And some of those things can get reorganized over time, and it's not always clear which exact collection of symptoms is like rooted in the same cause even. So I don't know. I'm generally uncomfortable with absolutes, so that like, I might be more open-minded about some things than those things even call for, but I'm more comfortable being open-minded about it than stating them as absolutes. That being said, assuming that this FBI team is looking at the research related to mental illnesses, including DID. The research would overwhelmingly talk about, like, child abuse being one of the major causes, but extensive childhood trauma being, like, the major cause of DID, of this collection of symptoms. And this collection of symptoms looks exactly like DID and looks nothing like anything else, basically. Unless you're going to try to argue that it's OSDD or something like that. But even then, it would be the same, like roughly the same collection of types of symptoms with some key differences, like lower amnesia or something. But it classically fits being a system and being dissociative, and this case especially is just such an easy, obviously traumagenic situation. It seems like they just got right up to that line and then didn't quite land it. Trying to stay grounded. Spencer is starting to be able to read the different body language of the different alters even before they start talking. It can also help because their behavior is pretty different for the most part. It's the most similar probably between Charles, the dad, and Raphael. But it's another one of those things that is pretty accurate, particularly because Spencer in particular is so good at reading people. He's so practiced at that, and he's very smart. But that is a thing that people who get to know systems really well can be able to do over time, especially in smaller systems and or alters in particular that you know very well. Like us with Primal Pack, frequent fronters, we know pretty well between each other's systems, and a lot of times we can not only tell that a switch happened, but have a pretty good idea of who it is. This isn't foolproof, obviously, and some alters will be more similar to each other than others, or it could be kind of blurry, or you could think you know who it is, but it's actually an alter you've never met before, especially in bigger systems, like ours, for instance. But there can be a lot of cases where you get to know different alters that well that you'd have a pretty good idea who it is. I still think it's good practice in a lot of cases to double check that, which Spencer is doing. He's asking if it's the person he thinks it is. But that would be a consent thing that'll also be different system to system. But I do think it's a cool thing that they included in here to make sure I stay fronting. The way that they're doing Spencer's flashbacks, in addition to how many times they've referenced Tobias's symptoms as being psychotic in some way, psychotic break, all that stuff, it seems like they're drawing a parallel specifically with schizophrenia, which is a little bit frustrating because DID and schizophrenia get mistaken for each other so often by, I would think primarily by people who don't have mental health training, but I'm sure there are cases, even with mental health training, of people not being trained well enough in those areas or having stigma against one or both of those disorders, not asking the right questions, etc. But actual clinical overlap between the specific symptoms and diagnostic criteria for those two disorders is like not really there at all. They're very, very different. There are just some symptoms that, like, the colloquial descriptions of those symptoms can sound similar, like hearing voices. as an example. And there are people who think, like, some of the ideas are oversimplified. Like, if someone sees anything differently than you see it, then it's immediately, like, delusional. But there are all kinds of situations where that's not the case. Really easy example I could give is, like, if somebody were colorblind and sees colors differently than other people and described them differently, that's not delusional. That's their brain working differently in a different way, you know? So there are things that, or like, the reverse is easier, actually. There are people who see more colors than the average. I think it's more rare than being colorblind, but I don't remember. But there are people who see more colors. And so, let's say I'm one of the people who sees more colors, and I'm talking to someone who sees average or maybe even who's colorblind. And I'm saying that this thing that I'm looking at has 2 different colors on it and you only see one. That, in that case, does not mean that I'm seeing something that isn't there. It means my brain can see something that your brain can't see. Or my eyes, or however you want to look at it, somewhere in the visual processing components. So that's an example of how, like, the absolute most basic, most colloquial description of a situation is not always going to point you in the right direction. And being colorblind or being one of the people who sees more colors isn't delusional, and DID isn't delusional or related to psychosis. And schizophrenia and DID are not really similar in any way that I can think of. I'm not as familiar with information about schizophrenia as I am with DID, but the amount that I've looked into it, because I don't think there's a dissociative component to schizophrenia that I've heard of. I could be wrong about this. But the comparison that I hear the most is of, like, is comparing alters to hallucinations or delusions of some kind, which isn't clinically the case. So that specific parallel that it seems like they're drawing is also frustrating, especially since they're explicitly calling the DID related symptoms psychotic over and over, because it's encouraging that parallel with schizophrenia, even though they're not calling the symptoms schizophrenia. Oh, it's done. Okay. Cool. I got through it. That was hard. I probably should not have done both episodes at the same time. We'll see if it has to be 2 parts. I feel like it's very possible it's gonna have to be 2 parts. Hopefully not more than 2 parts. I have no idea. But I'm not editing right now, so it doesn't matter. We'll figure it out. Oh, it's my rock. I forgot about my rock. Until I dropped it. I'm gonna see if I can manage to do some kind of summary final thoughts type thing. I think I said all the major things I wanted to already. But just as like an overview, if I can keep my thoughts together enough to do that. Obviously, it's another example of a murder with DID. It is a fairly believable, interesting motive. And again, it's not an example of, like, DID being the reason that someone is a murderer, necessarily. In this case, it's very much so the specific trauma and the way that they, like, responded to and internalized the trauma. But it's just related to DID because only 2 of the alters in the system internalize the trauma in that way. to like continue perpetrating it. It obviously still spreads that stigma of people with DID being dangerous serial killers, but it is a little bit better when there's a real motive given that's outside of that and somewhat believable. That being said, it was also graphic. I go back and forth on how I feel about that level of graphic, realistic portrayals of abuse. I think there's an argument that can be made that it helps people understand who might not understand otherwise. But there's also a part of me who feels like the people who need that to understand maybe don't need to understand. But it's not a type of situation where it's totally out of the blue in a show like this. So it's a little bit better than if it comes up in a context that's totally unexpected. Like if it were to come up and be remotely that level of graphic in like a comedy or something, that would be very different. People who go into watching a show like this, generally speaking, understand that there will be graphic violence and some level of psychological horror. And generally speaking, in terms of triggers, there's always a chance at any time that anything could be any level of triggering. So, like, we could watch a show marketed toward babies and have something be triggering somehow. So, it's not possible to... It's probably not possible to never run into a trigger, ever. And triggers can be really bad without being graphic, so it's not necessarily inherently worse than any other type of trigger just because it's so graphic. It also technically could have been more graphic than it was, so like sometimes I'm sure it's hard to find that balance of what's graphic enough to make it feel real and scary and stuff for the audience that's looking for that, but not like indulging in how graphic it is unnecessarily past that point. And not increasing the ratings too much and all that stuff for TV and movies. But obviously they didn't call it DID. In a lot of ways, it's outside of the murderer component, it's a really good representation of DID if you ignore basically everything other people say about it in the episodes. So if you look at the actual portrayal and not the outside descriptions of it, it's a pretty decent example of switching and different types of alters and different types of persecutors, and portrays trauma very well, which helps. But so much of the stuff that they said about it doesn't really fit, which is a little frustrating. I do think they fixed a lot of that in the one they did much later on. I honestly wonder if they did that on purpose, like if they were trying to correct the things that they said in this season that didn't line up with research and stuff about DID. But that's several seasons later. That might be the next thing we react to. I'm not sure yet. We do plan to react to it at some point, though. And I think that one's easier on us than this one. And I think it's just one episode instead of two. But I hope you liked this reaction. If you did, please click the like button to tell us and YouTube that you liked it. And subscribe and ring the bell to make sure you see all of our future reactions and other things we might do. We also, like we said earlier, have an extended commentary version of this that's on Patreon. And that's a way for you to watch along with us. And you get timestamps and all that stuff. And all of our reactions, even to the aspects of it that aren't related to DID. Or in some cases, trauma. In this case, at least. And the link to Patreon, if you want to look at that or any of our other tiers, is in the description and also like on our channel homepage, I think, on the banner. And just look around for it, you'll find it. But it's definitely in the description. And that is also where our wish list and our Etsy shop and our Discord server and stuff are. So if any of those sound interesting, there's all of those links in the description for you to look at. And those things really help us a lot. Yeah. I am running out of ability to focus and talk. So, let us know any thoughts or questions that you have in the comments and stuff like that. And thanks for watching. Bye.